As the smoke billowed from the still burning pyres of oil and shipping on the morning of the 8th of December 1941, the US Navy faced a significant challenge. 6 battleships, including the old training ship Utah, had either been sunk or were sinking, and the remaining 3 had all been damaged to various degrees. In addition, the Japanese assault had hit 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 4 auxiliary vessels, and a floating dock, sinking some and damaging others. This posed a twofold challenge. Firstly, there were now a lot of wrecks and damaged ships occupying valuable space in the Pacific Fleet's main anchorage, and secondly, the strength of the US Navy had just been drastically reduced. It needed ships, and thanks to the shallow nature of Pearl Harbor, it might be possible to bring some of the sunk ones back into service. There were plenty of challenges. Oil slicks still flowed thick in the harbour, with the oil reaching a depth of up to 2 inches on the surface in some places, as did mats of wreckage and inevitably bodies. Light craft such as the minesweeper USS Tern and its compatriots, which had survived when battleships had not, now found themselves playing hoses across the larger vessels that were still aflame and running pumps to vessels that weren't. Whilst it was fairly clear that Arizona was probably a total loss, although this wasn't 100% clear since she was still covered in a pall of smoke that obscured the forward part of the vessel, efforts to fight the fires on the parts of the Arizona that remained above the waterline did continue, partially because efforts on behalf of Tennessee were being hampered by thick clouds of choking black smoke that was rolling off of the Arizona, and partially because there were fears of a follow-up Japanese air attack, for which a giant black pool of burning oil and ship would make an excellent marker. Of the battleships afloat, Maryland was perhaps the least affected, but it was still dangerously down by the bow and still fighting flooding, whilst on the other side of Ford Island the cruiser USS Raleigh was cutting loose everything that they could to keep the ship upright after a torpedo had blown a hole in her side amidships. But even as crews fought to keep some ships afloat, the salvage efforts were actually already underway elsewhere. Indeed, in some ways they had actually been ongoing since before the Japanese aircraft had even left. After the USS Oklahoma had rolled over, for example, a number of men had escaped via some rather daring underwater swims through the upturned hull to report the locations of other survivors trapped within, and soon there were divers, drills, and cutting equipment working on trying to free anyone who could be contacted by hammering on the hull. In all, these efforts would save 26 men in 4 groups, whilst another 2 were tragically contacted but then accidentally suffocated by the fumes of the oxyacetylene cutters that were being used to try and reach them. Elsewhere, the cruiser Helena was shoring up against her own torpedo hit. The destroyer Shaw had lost its bow to a magazine explosion, but what was left was still afloat amidst the remains of the floating dry dock that she'd been in, and the battleship Nevada was in a slow but losing battle with progressive flooding as a mixture of water and oil advanced through bulkhead after bulkhead, as it was found that paths through areas that were supposed to be watertight weren't, for various reasons. Only her beaching on a coral ledge had kept her from slipping beneath the waves like many of her companions. Luckily, there were some transient officers who would be especially helpful. Lieutenant Commander Lebus Curtis V, for example, was in transit to the Red Sea to help with the Royal Navy clearing some ships that the Italians had sunk in a port in Eritrea, what's now Ethiopia. He was a salvage expert, and so he was heading over there to help them reopen the port, but now, instead of being in Hawaii for a couple of days stopover, he was called into action to help with his own fleet's efforts. The carrier USS Enterprise put in a brief appearance, but no matter how useful the crew and pumps of the carrier and her escorts might have been, she was needed elsewhere, and the force was soon back out to sea. Back in the harbour, California's commanding officer, Captain Wallin, had the dual advantages amongst the other battleship captains of being both alive and uninjured, and having his ship on a relatively even keel compared to some others, even if it wasn't going anywhere fast, still had fires aboard and was gradually settling. As such, he was dispatched to begin a tour of the harbour to work out which ships were still operational and what equipment was still operational, starting with the cruisers. USS New Orleans could be mostly ready within a day. The USS San Francisco was absolutely fine, but it had been in the middle of dock work that still needed a couple of weeks to complete. USS Honolulu had taken a near miss that flooded several magazines and was still working to counter the flooding, but could be ready again relatively soon, or at least mobile. USS Helena was of course going nowhere fast and was given priority for dry docking, as she could at least be moved in by tugs, which was more than could be said for the battleships, that all had significant underwater damage or else were trapped. Only Pennsylvania, and maybe Tennessee, were in any state to even begin to think of moving, much less fighting. There was, however, a silver lining to the big oil-fueled cloud. Apart from the floating dry dock that the destroyer USS Shaw had been in, and which was now sunk, all of the other docks were basically intact, as was the railway system that the base used to move things around, like heavy machinery. The machine shops, as well as the static and floating cranes, were all undamaged, and the piers, repair ships, tenders, and most of the base's on-site engineering and shipworking staff were also all intact, with the exception of the Vestal, which was in the process of trying to save itself. The intact oil tanks also meant that any and all machinery could be run pretty much 24/7 if needed, and Dry Dock 2, which hadn't actually been scheduled for completion for quite some time, anticipating opening around about Easter 1942, was actually well ahead of schedule and, to a limited degree, could already receive ships. Nonetheless, additional staff, machinery, and materials were requested from the continental United States, and a kind of warship triage began. Pennsylvania was to be extracted from Dry Dock 1 and replaced with Honolulu, as although she'd been hit, the damage was to her upper works and didn't threaten her watertight integrity. Maryland was scheduled for Dry Dock 2 as soon as Helena had been patched up. You might think a battleship would be a higher priority than a cruiser, but Maryland was currently trapped by the upturned hull of the Oklahoma and was burning out pumps one after the other in an effort to stay afloat and upright. She only had one major hole below the waterline, but it was letting in a disturbing amount of water. It was hoped that this could be isolated and pumped out with the help of a portable caisson, which would allow her to then be moved to the dry dock in good time. Demands on some of the specialist work crews were quite intense. Some officers wanted the divers to check out the torpedo nets to see if there were any holes that a midget submarine might use to slip into the harbour, as it was known that there had been a few on December the 7th. But these skilled personnel were instead kept back for work on the damaged and sunken vessels for as long as possible. Instead, the major infrastructure such as dry dock gates, as well as some of the damaged and sunken vessels, were protected by a series of impromptu torpedo defences, consisting of a mixture of sheet piling that was simply hammered into the seabed ahead of them on the most likely attack vectors, as well as a number of gunnery target rafts, which had a relatively deep draft anyway, and whose draft was further artificially increased with sheet metal as well as grids that had hastily spot-welded wire fencing attached to them, which were hung underneath them, with the intention of forcing any torpedoes that might be incoming to detonate against these relatively expendable aspects of the harbour, rather than the more valuable ships, or worse still, the gates to the dry docks that would be needed to patch up the ships. Wary of a follow-up air attack, power cables were also run out to the California and Nevada. The ships themselves were without their own power and partially resting on the seafloor, and in California's case, gradually heading further down, but for the moment the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns and their crews, where these were still above water, were pressed into service using the external power supplies to keep the guns running, just in case there was a return of the Japanese Navy. The various ongoing efforts would be formally consolidated into the Base Force Salvage Organisation a week after the attacks on the 14th of December, under the command of James Mortimer Steele, formerly commander of the USS Utah, which of course was a position that now no longer needed filling. The new organisation's role was self-explanatory and would allow the base itself to focus on repairs, refits and resupply of the still active combat forces that will be cycling through Pearl Harbor over the next few months and eventually years. Lieutenant Commander Curtis, the salvage officer we mentioned earlier, found himself in charge, unsurprisingly, of the ship's salvage section, with other sections being services and material, ordnance dealing with the sunken vessel's guns, ammunition, personnel, diving, salvage stores, public works to liaise with the civilian contractors, especially those who are rushing to complete Dry Dock 2 and working on Dry Docks 3 and 4, and finally the repairs section. But all of these vital personnel hadn't sat around for a week waiting for an official title. Dry Dock 2 had actually been declared operational on the 10th of December, with Helena being moved in immediately, and once the ship was on the blocks and the dock was pumped out, the repair crews were competing for space with the civilian workers, who still had to pour the concrete floor of the dry dock, which would allow for larger ships like the battleships and carriers to be accommodated, whilst above them, engineers were cobbling together steam and high-pressure water jets to clean both the ship and the dock of oil, which had drifted in with the ship, and would be a continuing problem for any dockyard work. Eventually, it would have to be skimmed off and cleared from the harbour, but for the moment there were significantly more important priorities. With that said, the problem it posed for the dockyard work cannot be understated, because you could bring a ship in, but when you drain the dock, the ship itself, being covered in oil, could be hosed down relatively quickly, but when your entire working surface, including the steps and ladders down into the basin of the dry dock, were covered with a thick sludge of decomposing oil, everything got very dangerous, very sticky, and very flammable very fast. And so it was absolutely vital that the engineers perfected their steam and high-pressure water cleaning equipment first before anything caught fire. It was quickly established that with the limited dockyard space available at Pearl Harbor, repairing the Helena fully was off the table. It could be done, but it would take far too long. Instead, anything that was brought in was to be patched up and repaired only as much as was needed to make the ship seaworthy for a trip to the west coast, where longer-term repairs and, where applicable, modernizations could be made. Ships like the San Francisco were to have their remaining overhauls completed as soon as possible and sent on their way. This should allow the cycling through of some of the still technically afloat ships before their systems could break down and they sunk as well, and it would also mean that the full capacity of Pearl's docks could be used in the salvage effort, whilst still being available at relatively short notice in case of ships returning with battle damage. The rule of thumb was that anything that needed more than a month's work, unless it was patching a ship up to make it seaworthy, was to be done back on the continental United States. The first issues that the new organisation needed to overcome were a lack of storage space for recovered material from the ships, a lack of manpower, and the fact that one of the key assets, the repair ship Vestal, had been hit by 2 bombs and then the shockwave of the Arizona exploding right alongside it. As a result, she was currently beached and having to see to her own survival. The manpower issue was at least solved by drafting in newly arrived sailors as well as portions of the crew from California, West Virginia, and Nevada. The ships identified as priorities for the salvage efforts were Tennessee, California, and Nevada, as these were the ships that would appear to be the easiest to recover. Maryland wasn't on the list because, as she'd not technically sunk yet, she didn't fall under the remit of the salvage operation, but rather the main naval base. Each ship was assigned its own project officer, as well as a group of men, with engineers and damage control officers from the ships themselves also assigned to the groups due to their pre-existing knowledge of the layout of their own ships. West Virginia was then identified as a 4th priority, and a similar arrangement was set up for work on that ship. Whilst this was going on, both Saratoga and Enterprise, with their respective escort groups, would cycle through the harbour on different occasions, which complicated matters somewhat as ships and boats did a merry dance around each other, heading in all sorts of directions. Unfortunately, despite heroic efforts, the California was gradually slipping beneath the waves. Water was coming in faster than the pumps could keep up with, and the ship slipped into a silt bank until only parts of the superstructure and the upper main battery turrets were visible. It wasn't for lack of trying, however. Hawsers, wire cabling, and even a chain around the second turret barbette were tried in an attempt to keep the ship close to the quayside, but all this accomplished was a series of loud bangs as the various moorings parted, and in one or two cases where the cables were particularly strong, the bollards that they were attached to were simply wrenched out of their sockets. Focus instead switched to Nevada, which had been chained in place as well to stop her sliding off of the large rock that was supporting the stern. With Dry Dock 2 able to accept ships of up to 42 foot in draft, the estimate to get the ship from its current 48 foot in draft down to 40 foot would mean pumping out over 10,000 tons of water. Some other schemes to reduce her draft still further were considered, but the amount of water that would have to be displaced was truly ridiculous. Divers instead set to work in cutting away parts of the hull that had been blasted outward and would get in the way of any patch, whilst the upturned hull of her sister ship was used to measure the size and shape of the patch that would be needed. This effort, needing over 500 dives, was complicated by the fact that most of the salvage gear on the island had been bought in the 1920s and shoved into a warehouse somewhere and improperly stored, meaning that most of it was broken, and what was left worked suboptimally, with many of the leather and rubber seals and gaskets having been expended strengthening the jaw muscles of several generations of the local rat population. Fortunately, however, more up-to-date and less gnawed equipment was being rapidly flown out along with more specialists from the west coast. The Tennessee was another matter entirely. Once the fires were out, the ship was actually mostly ready for action with one major problem. West Virginia, moored outboard of her, had rolled to port when struck by torpedoes, with the West Virginia's underwater hull catching and wedging on the Tennessee's armor belt. Then, as counterflooding levelled the ship, with the wedging having bought enough time for this to take effect, West Virginia had settled in such a way that it pinned Tennessee in place. Maryland was at this stage still in front of her. There was enough room astern, in theory, for a tug to pull her out, turn her 90 degrees, and then extract her between the stern of West Virginia and what was left of the bow of the Arizona, except that no tug on Earth was going to be able to pull the ship out from between the Key and West Virginia, so tightly was she wedged. Eventually, it was decided they'd have to demolish a section of the Key to enable her extraction, and whilst that was getting underway, the onboard repairs to fire-damaged areas of the ship could begin. Men with pickaxes and breakers began work on the quayside, but they barely made a dent. The workers who'd originally built it had done a little bit too good of a job. Logically, of course, the next step was to bring in dynamite and try to blow up the recalcitrant masonry. But in the event, even this proved to be a remarkably slow process. By the time it had actually been done, patches had been applied to various minor holes in the hull, and Maryland had actually been towed away for her turn in the dock, and so it was decided to tow Tennessee out forwards instead, as this would avoid the rather delicate 90-degree turn. Whilst California had settled, it had been something of a slow-motion process, and so various items such as secondary guns, fire control equipment, and ammunition had been able to be salvaged as the water rose, whilst a similar but somewhat slower effort was being made on the resting hulk of the West Virginia. This recovered equipment was then used to replace and or supplement the armament of various ships that were still afloat, as well as the island's own defences. Meanwhile, it was decided to try and salvage the California, which by now had become deeply embedded in the silt beneath it, by building a sheet pile cofferdam around the ship and draining all the water. Several other more esoteric methods, such as freezing the water in the area of the hull breaches, had been suggested, but whilst this had worked in more northern climes, it was pointed out that the amount of cooling equipment needed to keep an ice plug intact in Hawaiian temperatures would be truly monumental. With the initial decisions and priorities made, efforts now turned to implementing these plans, and also beginning an extensive cataloguing of all the damage found, the repair and salvage methods that were used, and how well they worked, as well as any suggestions on remedying the weaknesses that were identified in the various ships' construction as the work progressed. This would all prove invaluable in the years ahead in both the design and refit of ships, and in briefing and training the crews of ships that were heading into combat. At the same time, a limited amount of salvage work was being done to the minesweeping command vessel Oglala, which had been moored just alongside a pier. Due to the priority list, she was slated to just be removed from her position, as she was mainly taking up valuable berthing space. To make things easier, she was stripped down to a basic hull and superstructure, strapped to a couple of pontoons, and pumped full of air. Unfortunately, it turned out her old hull wasn't strong enough to take all the new stresses, and she leaked air faster than it could be pumped in. By the 20th of December, that effort had been abandoned, and the works crews dispersed to other efforts on other ships. But in better news, what was left of the destroyer Shaw was recovered from the sunken, formerly floating, dry dock, put into a working dry dock, and stripped of all her armament. She could be repaired, but between the missing bow, the shock damage, and the water infiltration, she'd be in refit for quite a while, and her guns could be used on other ships. And so, back to the battleships. It turned out that part of the breach, caused by the torpedo hit to Nevada, was actually beneath the mud which that portion of the ship was laying in. Luckily, the patch they'd been making was wood, so it could be modified. Unfortunately, the dredging and diving efforts that ascertained this also found numerous other smaller holes, probably from various near misses. These would also need to be patched up to get the ship afloat, but at least she wasn't going anywhere. By the 20th of December, the list of things to do in priority order were issued as follows. First priority was removal of the main battery of the California. Second was to try and remove the Oklahoma from her present berth. Third was the salvage of anti-aircraft guns. Fourth, the refloating of the Nevada. Fifth, the refloating of the floating dry dock that Shaw had been in, YFD-2. Sixth, the refloating of the California. Seventh, the docking of the Raleigh. Eighth, the removal of miscellaneous ordnance equipment and ammunition that hadn't been covered in any of the above. Ninth, the refloating of West Virginia. 10th, the recovery of material that the Bureau of Ships and the Bureau of Supplies and Accounts identified. 11th, the recovery of a Japanese submarine. And 12th, the recovery of sunken boats, torpedoes, tubes, and various miscellaneous gear now in the harbour that had been thrown off of various ships in an effort to keep them afloat in the first few hours after the attack. The reason that they wanted California's guns so urgently wasn't to try and build a couple of copies of Fort Drum in Hawaii. It was because California, unlike Nevada, seemed to be on the move again. The pier she'd been berthed at was, as mentioned previously, in an area of mud and silt. The pilings that had been installed to support the pier in the first place had in some cases needed to go down over 100 feet into the seabed before they'd actually hit something solid enough to support the pier. And now it looked like this very fine mud was slowly swallowing the battleship, and removing around 2,000 tons of top weight by taking off the main battery might, it was hoped, lighten the ship enough to at least slow this process down. And the idea for her salvage was still to go in with a sheet piling cofferdam, but that material was wending its way to a port in the continental United States by train, and well over a month away from even arriving, let alone being installed. If the ship sank considerably lower in the mud in the interim, this might completely obscure the damage and make it almost impossible to patch or pump out, and of course the suction fighting her removal would be immense. And so off came the turret tops, and out came the guns. Elsewhere, in Dry Dock 1, the removal of Pennsylvania meant that the dock could be drained and the two destroyers present, Cassin and Downs, could be looked over. The news here really wasn't good. Between multiple bombs and their own torpedoes going off, plus being set on fire, the two ships were effectively warped heaps of scrap metal whose only real value was the prime dry dock real estate that they were currently occupying, and whatever internal machinery might have survived. As it would eventually turn out, the wrecks of both ships would be stripped down and brand new ships built around whatever salvageable machinery was left inside and given the old destroyers' hull numbers and names, but that was for the far future. Elsewhere still, they'd managed to find the wreck of a Japanese midget submarine, and so when the battleships were done being swallowed by the seabed, some efforts were being made to haul this up as well. There was some good news though. On the same day as all of this, Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, all patched up to varying degrees, headed out on the voyage back to the west coast for further repairs. Pennsylvania heading to Mare Island, and Tennessee and Pennsylvania headed for Puget Sound. Once that work was done, they would join Colorado, Idaho, New Mexico, and Mississippi in guarding the west coast against any further possible assault, the 4 battleships on their way at various stages from other postings. With the harbour thus somewhat less crowded and dry dock space opened up again, the piling for California on its way, and the patches for Nevada being manufactured, whilst divers headed into the latter ship through some of the larger holes in order to close up internal bulkheads and valves, which would help with later salvage efforts, attention was turned to USS West Virginia. Knowing that she'd been hit multiple times, and keeping in mind the lessons of the Nevada, the salvage crews knew that they had no idea just what state the hull might be in, and so a program of dives was begun so as to gather this data. This was very difficult work, as not only was the state of the diving equipment still relatively primitive by what we might imagine, but they were also operating in near darkness. The water was not especially clear anyway, and of course the thick coating of oil atop of it meant that they were effectively trying to chart out an entire battleship by feel alone, which of course came with its own inherent risks, as if you were in a diving suit and you happened to grab onto a sharp bit of protruding metal, there was every chance you might breach your suit and have to do an emergency surface. There was also a much grimmer task for some of the divers, as they progressed along the hull with large hammers, every 15 to 20 feet stopping to hammer repeatedly on the outside of the hull, hoping to hear some echoes back from men trapped inside. Closer to the surface, aboard all ships, the removal of delicate equipment like rangefinders and fire control systems was accelerated. They'd need to be cleaned and checked, which would take a while, and the idea was to have them ready to go back on the ships once they were raised and patched. Whilst the individual elements didn't weigh all that much, collectively that did all add up, and of course these items were relatively high on the ships, whose stability at this point in time was of course somewhat questionable, and would become even more so as differential buoyancy started up when air was being pumped into them. Some thought was being given to putting a cofferdam around the Arizona. The ship was clearly a write-off by this point, but it would make salvaging equipment and recovering bodies somewhat easier. In the end, though, the expense was not considered to be worth the effort, and aside from some minor salvage on the stern section and a prolonged series of dives to access some of the higher value low bulk items like the safe containing the ship's pay chest, the ship was largely left alone by the end of the year. Also, around this time, the first reports from West Virginia were coming in. Despite the hull resembling something of a Swiss cheese from various near misses, direct hits, and splinter damage, the ship was actually in much better shape than many had suspected, and it began to become apparent that she could actually be salvaged. And with that news, the salvage crews swung into what was now a semi-familiar routine, clearing the decks, recovering equipment, and removing damage or extraneous bits of the superstructure, and making preparations to remove the main battery. As 1941 turned into 1942, everything was changing. Admiral Kimmel had been relieved of command, and Admiral Nimitz was appointed in his place. The pace of salvage operations was beginning to swing towards preparations for raising the ships, and the entire salvage operation was about to receive a new boss. Captain Steele was about to be promoted, and California's former commander, Captain Wallin, was to now take charge. As 1942 began, work was now continuing apace on getting the ships back afloat and into dock. The first good news in this regard was West Virginia. Thanks to a combination of Tennessee's unintentional save and the crew's own efforts, she'd settled upright, and so divers estimated that if the various holes could be patched and pumping done in a sensible order from the top down, she should just rise back up to the surface on an even keel, which in turn meant that a lot of the initial work on removing her main battery could now be stopped. This in turn would save a lot of time and effort both in actually removing the guns now and later on in reinstalling the guns once the ship was ready for sea again. Instead, work could be redoubled on cleaning and preserving the guns in place and getting various smaller holes patched ready for the lift. In the process of this, they also managed to recover what was left of one of the torpedoes that had struck the ship, which gave some of the base's weapons officers something to study. Across the Channel, an incredibly encouraging event was witnessed by those hard at work on Battleship Row as the floating dry dock YFD-2, formerly home to what was left of the USS Shaw, bubbled its way back to the surface. Thanks to not taking any direct hits, but rather being subjected to shrapnel and shockwave damage from the Shaw's magazine explosion, the process of refloating had been, relatively speaking, simple. Pumping air back into it and then having divers and other crew watching to see whether air or water bubbled out from various places and then applying small patches as necessary in those locations. Not only was this the first major salvage success, it would soon mean increased dock space at Pearl Harbor, although due to water getting into spaces that it really hadn't been welcome in, it was necessary to moor a small ship of some sort next to it at all times for the next few weeks in order to provide clean water and steam power, and of course there would need to be some immediate further repairs that were necessary, mainly surrounding the denting and warping of various parts of the dock's plating that had resulted from the explosion of Shaw and the resulting fires. Now the first rush of work on the recoverable battleships had taken place, it was also possible to spare men and divers for a better look at the Utah. While she was going to be a much lesser priority for overall salvage, there was still a fair bit of valuable equipment that could be removed from her, and then relocated to other vessels. But she'd rolled over onto her superstructure, and it was thought that this might break at any moment, and the divers would therefore be at risk of the ship rolling further, or moving. Luckily, the seabed on that side of Ford Island was somewhat firmer than the near-quicksand conditions which California found herself in, so it wasn't so much of a concern that the ship would move, and it quickly became apparent that Utah had actually gone over with enough force to shear away her masts and almost all other major superstructure elements, which meant that she was about as stable as it was possible to be for an overturned wreck, as she was resting on the stronger elements of her structure that were unlikely to give way. Still, there was precious little point in sending divers down, under, and then back into the ship, apart from the risk of bent air hoses, and so instead work began on cutting open the underside of the ship in selected locations and sending the divers more directly into the former lower decks to start recovering the large amounts of ammunition still in the ship's magazines, whilst pumps lowered the overall water level inside the hull, which allowed salvage workers with respirator masks only to assist in the areas which could be drained, thus freeing up fully equipped divers for work elsewhere. Many of those trained men would find their way over to what is apparently actually the Nevada, not the Nevada, where the various patches ranging from the size of a small window, mostly used to cover up a splinter hole or two, all the way up to the massive curved piece of master carpentry that was going to cover the torpedo impact site, were now in the process of being brought out and fixed into place on the ship, then sealed, checked, and rechecked. Whilst this work was going on down below, several large pumps were being installed on the upper deck of the ship itself, even as a floating derrick carefully edged its way between the California and the refloated dry dock, with the centrepiece of the salvage work ready for lowering and fitting, this of course being the Big Patch. As said Big Patch was prepared for lowering and even more pumps were being installed, a small collection of barges began to assemble around the Nevada. Some were taking away debris as sections of the ship were cleared, others carrying boilers to provide the now ubiquitous steam and hot water cleaning jets to get rid of the oil. Still others for the recovery of personal property, amongst other things, where this could be salvaged. The details were numerous, down to the installation of long clotheslines back on land in order to dry out and salvage what was left of the crew's clothing, where this was salvageable at all. The Big Patch was lowered, but soon ran into problems. The lower section kept snagging on mud under the ship, and when this was dredged away it revealed coral, which would also need to be cut through. As this went on, some of the pumps were activated and the de-watering of the ship began. Apart from anything else, it was thought this might raise Nevada somewhat, reducing the workload for the clearance crews who were trying to get enough room for the Big Patch to fit underneath the ship. After a couple of days, everything down to the second deck was free of water, although without the big patch in place there was a limit to how much further these efforts could go, but the cleanup of the upper portions of the ship could begin. The cleanup job would turn out to be possibly second only to body recovery duty in terms of being a job that nobody wanted to get assigned to. Imagine for a moment a thick soup of oil, paper, ink, clothing, raw meat, and other fresh provisions, and worse, that had all been left to collect together in semi-warm water, all enclosed in a large metal container that had then been subjected to heating by first fire, and then repeated warm Hawaiian days. Then left to ferment for over a month, and then, with most of the water drained away, and all the remaining solid and semi-liquid mass collecting together in pools and heaps across multiple decks, still in a relatively enclosed environment. About the only small mercy was that since the ship was still not on quite an even keel, once the larger items had been removed, like half carcasses of cows and sheep, the rest could be hosed down with hot water jets, and the resulting sludge collected at the lower end of the ship, where a skimming unit could come in to collect and dispose of it. This would be followed by waves of men with cleaning rags and brushes, blowers circulating hot, fresh air, and additional water-repelling and sealing chemicals which were used on the machinery. The big patch was, however, posing problem after problem. The coral wasn't budging easily, and it turned out that the lower edge of the patch was bumping into the portside docking keel. This was a wooden part of the ship's structure that was designed to support the ship when it was on blocks in a dry dock, and naturally it had been made of exceptionally tough wood, and so cutting through it underwater was proving to be extremely tedious. In the end, much like the dock key that had pinned Tennessee in place, the next logical step was clearly small charges of dynamite, which did at least get the job done somewhat faster. Some of the smaller holes were still leaking to varying degrees, and although patches were slowing this down, it was known that any leakage would increase dramatically once the ship started to move, and so it wasn't a case of completely sealing the ship, more just ensuring that the rate of water coming in would be less than the capacity of the pumps to chuck it back out again. By the end of the month, the clearance efforts had managed to reach some of the ship's own pumps, and these were cleaned, serviced, and fired back up, the battleship itself now lending aid to its own salvage effort. As the ship began to slowly flex under the increased buoyancy, the process was becoming a very delicate balancing act. Remove too little water and the ship's draft would not allow it to clear the dry dock. Remove too much, and with only or mostly air on the inside of the big wooden patch, the pressure of the water outside might crush the wooden framing in, and the ship would then sink again. By the start of February, the big patch was now in the last stages of adjustment before it was locked into position, and the full third deck was now clear of water. Anchors were run out to stabilise the ship when it got free, and to stop it drifting away. It wasn't getting any easier, though. Several men were killed by concentrated hydrogen sulfide gas, which was a product of the various organic materials aboard decomposing, which had then been concentrated under pressure in the water, and then been released when a new compartment was being inspected to see if it needed pumping out. As a result, further ventilation equipment was brought in, and the work continued. By the second week of the month, the stern had risen several feet, and the whole ship was now rising at the rate of about a foot per day. Friday the 13th of February might have been considered unlucky for some, but on that day in 1942 came the welcome official news that, with a flurry of displaced sediment, the sleeping giant that was the Nevada had roused itself and was afloat once more. But due to the slowing of the work to account for the hydrogen sulfide issue and the considerable amount of water left in compartments just inside of the big patch, it wasn't likely the ship would reach a draft that was sufficient to get it into Dry Dock 1. Luckily, though, Dry Dock 2 could take deeper draft ships, and with that dock having recently cleared the torpedo-damaged carrier Saratoga for passage back to the continental United States, the Nevada preferred for relocation to the new dock. The magazines, recently cleared of water, were emptied, and on the 17th tow lines were attached, and the ship was towed out into the middle of the channel. With the Nevada now in deeper water, divers found the big patch had actually extended several feet deeper than expected, which would itself scupper the attempt to get her into any dry dock, even dry dock 2. Although removing it now would mean significantly increased pressure on all the closed internal bulkheads around the breach, it was decided to try and do so there and then, and hope that the bulkheads held on the last bit of the journey, since once the ship got going, it could then be run right into the dock instead of stopped at the entrance to enact the same procedure of taking the patch off there. As ultimately, if the bulkheads failed, the ship would likely capsize in a matter of minutes, and if that was going to happen, it was honestly better that it happened in the channel, where dredging and blasting efforts might be able to make some kind of path around her, rather than right outside one of Pearl Harbor's precious dry docks, where there really wasn't another route in. As the sun rose on the 18th, the pumps aboard Nevada were on up to full power, the tugs came alongside, and the ship began the run for the dry dock. It was considerably down by the bow due to the body of water that was still inside due to the torpedo hole, but with some of the aft tanks flooded to get the whole ship to rotate slightly so the very tip of the bow rose just a fraction, by 10 o'clock in the morning she was over the threshold of dry dock 2, the dock gates were closed, and water began to be pumped out. As the water level, and thus the pressure, decreased, the pumps could also start clearing out some of the water in the bow compartments, levelling out the ship so that it could be settled onto the dry dock blocks. With Admiral Nimitz watching, the first of the salvaged battleships came to a gentle rest as the water levels dropped lower, eventually being left high and dry with water cascading out of various breech compartments as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon. Winding the clock back to the start of January, we'll head on over to California, not the state, the battleship, somewhat shorter journey. 3 of her 4 turrets were able to be worked on, with everything that was being removed being carefully labelled so that it could all be put back together again once the ship was out of the current predicament. The plan for the salvage of the ship had changed somewhat. Instead of encircling the entire ship with one massive steel cofferdam, which events had shown would probably just be swallowed up by the mud anyway, it had been decided that a partial wooden version would enclose a portion of the ship, with smaller versions around each torpedo hit. Smaller holes than this would have wooden patches placed over them just in the water, and the larger ones, sheltered by the various cofferdams, would be filled in with concrete held in by a wooden formwork. The difference between this and the approach taken on Nevada was the need to clear the holes of mud first, and the fact that California was, for now at least, pretty much stuck in place and had more holes in her. Sealing the compartments around each hole and then pumping the rest of the ship out, as on Nevada, simply wouldn't get her free, and even if she was dug out, the ship's draft would prevent her from ever docking for repairs, so she had to be as sealed up as possible and then as completely drained as possible. The weight of the concrete would of course mean she was still running deep, but not deep enough to prevent her getting over the sill of the dry dock. That was the idea, anyway. There were delays in getting the guns out of the turrets, as these needed the attention, quite understandably, of the biggest of the floating cranes in the base's possession, and demand for the particular services of those cranes was a little bit high. Still, after several days of on and off lifting, all guns, except those of Turret 4, were away, and the first of the wooden patches for the ship arrived. This one was designed to cover the largest hole not being dealt with via cofferdam, this being a breach in the bow that had been caused by near miss from a bomb. Like the Nevada, California would need fresh water and steam generators, pressure washers, ventilation equipment and such, but since the sides of the ship would be littered by cofferdams, that would hinder the approach of barges, it was instead decided to install all of this on the upper deck, along with the first of numerous pumps. The massive timbers needed for these cofferdams were being prepared ashore, but the number of carpenters was limited, and the use of a similar approach on the West Virginia was dividing their attention, and so work began to slow, as the only things left to do really were to ensure that small water entry points were stopped up and the casemates were sealed. Thus, it wasn't until the same day as Nevada got afloat that the cofferdams began construction on the California. Whilst above water, the last of the cage mast material, along with the heavy conning tower, was in the process of being cut down or unbolted, respectively. Now, quite experienced thanks to their work on Nevada, the cofferdams started to be installed at a rapid pace. Within 10 days, most of the cofferdams were in place, and the divers prepared for the next task, sealing them. This couldn't be done ashore, as the inevitable slight movements in the wooden structures when they were fixed to the ship's side would inevitably cause minor deformations. So the only solution was to watch for leaks as the pumps cleared the interiors, and then have divers plug those leaks externally as the water levels continued to drop. Inside the ship, various covers, seals and doors were being closed, tightened or replaced as necessary, oil was being pumped out of various areas that it had collected in, and the conning tower began to be lifted off of its seating. With most of February gone, the pumps started up and the divers started their sealing work, watching the flow of any stray drifts of oil in the water to work out where the water was being drawn to. Within a few days, the forecastle deck was dry and work on the quarterdeck cofferdam, the largest, was well underway. Cleaning the forward part of the ship began as good news emerged from below. Like with Nevada, there was a good chance that due to the underwater repairs and replacement of various seals, doors and manhole covers within the ship, it might be possible to get the California refloated without having to completely seal up the torpedo holes with concrete. The balancing act of getting water out versus not having the bulkheads collapse would be similar, as with the California's older relative, but it would save time both now, in terms of not actually having to pour massive amounts of concrete, and later when it came to making repairs in the dry dock, because you wouldn't then have to break out massive amounts of concrete. This was all just as well, since manpower was becoming a major issue, with large salvage efforts ongoing on West Virginia, some limited recovery of materials happening on Arizona, and work going on to various destroyers and the minesweeping command ship Oglala. The demands for large numbers of men were increasing daily, and the cleaning and clearing work was incredibly manpower intensive and slowing down again. This wasn't helped by the fact that as time had gone on, various members of the California's crew, including some of her most experienced men, had been sent off to other roles in the fleet, which left them with fresh levies of sailors completely unfamiliar with the ship having to be trained by the shrinking pool of men who were familiar with it, which slowed work further still. And that was without the big issue hanging over the whole project. Both California and West Virginia were turbo-electric drive ships, and electrical equipment really does not like prolonged submergence in salt water, even before all the other pollutants involved in this particular incident got involved. It was an open question as to if at least some of the equipment would be salvageable once the ships got into dock. If not, then the entire trip back to the continental United States would have to be made entirely under tugs without any power aboard the ship itself, except for maybe the odd generator to provide a few lights. That would be an incredibly dangerous proposition. By early March, the last of the cofferdam sections were being secured and sealing of them was ahead of schedule. The main conning tower was now ready to be taken off, and the second conning tower had likewise been broken free of its stand. By mid-March, the suction of the mud was beginning to be overcome as between the pumps and the natural buoyancy of the cofferdam's wooden construction, the stern was beginning to rise out of the mud, bringing the vessel to a slightly more even fore-to-aft level, although the ship was still listing to port. Still, the cleaning of the bulk of the ship could begin, as it was pumped out level by level, taking in all the lessons from the Nevada, including the need for plenty of ventilation to prevent the build-up of hydrogen sulfide. By the 15th of March, the cleaning work was well underway as rivers of sludge either ran or were pumped out, whilst across the channel the happy sight of the Nevada emerging from Dry Dock 2 was seen. Now, the ship was watertight enough to be towed over to the general repair facilities, opening up the dock for another ship. Still, the cleaning work on California would take a lot longer. She was, after all, a larger ship, and more of her had been underwater. Captain Wallin sent out a lengthy message to encourage the works crews, setting them to a certain degree in competition with what he rather deliberately characterized as the industrious Japanese, and exhorting the men of the United States Navy to show that surely they were better at hard work than their enemies were. The work thus continued apace, but as they reached further down into the ship, it became a much grimmer task. Almost 50 of the ship's crew had never been found after the attack, and soon enough, on the second deck level, the repair crews began to find what was left of many of these unfortunate men. Pumping slowed at the third deck level to allow for recovery of the remains, which, grim as it sounds, were easier to float into bags than to recover in bits from a drained deck. This effort recovered about half of the missing crew and allowed the ship to break free of the mud completely just after March the 20th. By the 29th, only 16 men were left unaccounted for, and after a thorough search of the remaining third deck area, the pumps were ramped back up again. By the end of the month, the ship only showed a slight list to port, although with a draft of 43 feet, there was still some work to be done. Luckily, most of the oil had been taken out of the ship during the pause at the third deck level, so the engine room salvage efforts would only have to deal with massive saltwater contamination instead of all of that, plus oil sludge. By the 3rd of April, the ship was riding high enough to get into a dock. But now there was no space available. Lexington had arrived earlier in the day for refit in Dry Dock 2, and a cruiser plus 2 destroyers occupied Dry Dock 1. Work had progressed at almost warp speed on Dry Dock 3, but Dry Dock 3 had been designed to handle smaller ships and was too small to fit the battleship. Instead, they would have to wait for a few days until after the 8th, when Lexington was due to head over to the fitting out and repair basin. Whilst they were waiting, the anchor chain that had been used months previously to try and keep the ship closer to the quay was unwrapped from around the barbette of Turret 1, and various plates used to seal the upper areas of the ship, such as the casemates, were removed to reduce overall weight, since now those areas were reasonably above the waterline again. Clearing of the magazines, cleaning of the engine rooms, and the short straw job of emptying the meat locker were also undertaken, with a random large explosion, probably caused by a pocket of uncovered aviation gasoline that had fumigated, adding to a bit of excitement to the proceedings. Although 5 men were injured, luckily nobody was killed. More seriously, the explosion blew off a patch that sent water back into numerous cleared compartments, and that in turn sent the bow plunging 5 feet further down. Luckily, all the pumps and crew were called on, and the area was isolated, repatched, and pumped out again over the next few days, with one of the conning towers lifted off the ship to assist with the weight issue. And so it was that on the 9th of April, the California became the second battleship to be successfully salvaged from the depths, entering Dry Dock 2 at around 11 o'clock in the morning, joined in the dock by the small tug Sotoyomo, which had been recovered from next to the floating dry dock YFD-2. The water level was dropped, and repair work could begin in earnest, with some of her big electrical components being lifted out for further repair work back home, their transport back to the continental United States being the Nevada, which was almost ready to head for Puget Sound, with a sailing date set of the 22nd of April. So, of the battleships that had been damaged or sunk during the attack, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Nevada, and California were now afloat and in some stage of repair, refit, or shakedown cruise. That left 4, and once you accounted for the fact that Arizona was already being considered a write-off, and Utah, being a training ship, was not as vital for the war effort as compared to the theoretically combat-capable vessels, you're actually just down to Oklahoma and West Virginia. So, once more, let's wind the clock back to the beginning of January and travel a few hundred yards further up the channel still to the West Virginia herself. The shortages of skilled workers that had affected Nevada and California also affected West Virginia, but unlike those ships, since the guns and most of the other superstructure were not going to be removed, except where already damaged, some of that workforce in question wasn't actually needed, which did serve to alleviate the pressure on the other 2 big ships. But the one thing the ship did need was carpenters. A patching system was also called for here, but whereas the other 2 ships had holes, which were in some cases quite large, but were at least distinct punctures. On West Virginia, the damage that was closest to something that you could coherently patch was an area below the forward superfiring turret. But amidships, in an area roughly delineated as the space between the two masts, there was basically just a twisted mess of material and plating that had once ostensibly been the ship's hull, but now looked more like an angry velociraptor deity with C4-equipped claws had taken a swipe at the ship. The only way to solve this was to get a monster patch in, and to get that to even fit required sending in divers to cut away all the various outturned bits of metal where they could, and elsewhere just simply detach entire hull panels that were too far gone. However, before they could start, there was some work to do above the waterline, where twisted and fire-weakened elements of the superstructure and the upper deck threatened to break free and fall on the divers, or their supporting units, at pretty much any time, not to mention potentially snagging air hoses and the like, and so work had to be begun on cutting away the worst of this. The resulting wreckage and other debris were then taken ashore and sorted into a myriad different categories. Some of it would just be thrown away, other items would be melted down for their metal, items that could be repaired and reconditioned for equipping the ship later on went into storage, and certain items in very high demand on active-duty warships like rangefinders and telescopes were sent off to a stockpile of ready-use items waiting for a ship to come back from the deep Pacific with a need for a new piece of equipment. Preparations were made for the now, unfortunately, familiar task of clearing out a waterlogged ship and, of course, the grim task of recovering bodies. More crew were unaccounted for on West Virginia than had been the case on California or Nevada, and the divers had, for the first few weeks, reported faint tapping sounds coming from within the hull. But by mid-January, these noises had gradually faded away to a grim silence. Adding to the list of things to do was a diving report from the stern at the end of the month. The rudder had vanished, which seemed very careless, and in its place there was another heretofore unreported torpedo hole, which would need further trimming and patching. A search around the stern eventually located the two pieces of the rudder it had been blown in two, as well as the aft end of the torpedo that had been responsible. This latter part was hauled out, and this now doubled the US Navy's cache of Japanese torpedo parts. By the end of January, the first supporting elements of the patches had arrived, and frames began to be attached to the ship. Whilst above the current waterline, work was done to further shore up the deck so that it would support A-frame cranes, pumps, and the various other equipment that would be due to be installed. And as the masts were going to be replaced anyway, and they contributed greatly to top weight, work was also started in taking down the mainmast. By the time Nevada passed by on its way into dock, the first of the patch faces were going the other way to West Virginia. Unlike the patches designed for the other two ships, the ones for West Virginia would have to replace large sections of the ship's outer shell, and thus were a composite of concrete, steel, and wood. Also, because of the sheer area involved, there would not be any single large units, but rather multiple smaller, relatively speaking at least, and easier to handle sections that would then be joined together once they were in place. So extensive was the hull damage that, for a good portion of the amidship section, about the only part of the ship that was somewhat where it was supposed to be was the belt armour. And even this was somewhat bent out of shape. Everything above and below it was either just gone, or else had been punched so deep into the ship that it was practically useless. And so the belt itself became part of the patch system, since 13-inch thick slabs of steel turned out to be rather excellent solid mounting points for the lower or upper edges of the patches, as applicable. There was also the delicate task of partially entering the ship through the various rents in the hull to find where intact frames might be in order to mount shoring beams, so that the water pressure didn't simply cave in the patches as water was pumped out and the external pressure relative to the internal pressure increased. Fresh from success cleaning mud out from underneath the Nevada, Divers began clearing mud off of the coral that was supporting the West Virginia's weight to allow the lowest tier of patches to be fixed on parts of the hull that still remained. By the end of February, most of the individual patches were in place, with the exception of the long one on the upper section of West Virginia's side, and the job of adjusting the fit and sealing the gaps between the individual sections with concrete that were in place could begin. Soon the steam boilers, pumps and other equipment began to arrive, and places on the open area of the ship were sought for them. Portholes were either shut or plated over where this wasn't possible, and with a rattle and then a thrum, the highest of the ship's galleys, cleaned out and prepared, came back to life, allowing the works crews to get their meals aboard the ship without a long and complicated filtering off of the ship to Ford Island, and then back again. As air compressors and pumps arrived aboard and the mainmast was lifted off, the retention of more of the ship's upper works meant a premium on space for the equipment, and it was decided to turn the aftmost turret to free up centerline deck space. But, as it turned out, shells in the handling room had rolled into the gears during the sinking. The next job was thus, instead, to dive down and close the various hatches into the barbette so that it could be pumped out. The shells could then be extracted, and the turret would then be free to rotate. Preparations continued, but further work on pumping out the ship paused whilst the main effort was made to get California up and away. Instead, the rest of the ship's hatches were opened to drain all internal water to the lowest levels, where powerful pumps could more easily extract it. This was remarkably different to Nevada and California, where as many of these hatches and manhole covers had been closed as was humanly possible, but it reflected a slightly different way of salvaging. By mid-April, the remaining sections of patching were being placed and ammunition was being removed from the various turrets. Pumping began in earnest, and with the lessons learned from the aft turret, the forward turret was also rotated to make way for another large pump. At this stage, with the final patching sections not quite yet watertight, the aim of the pumps wasn't to actually unwater the ship, but to get the worst of the hydrogen sulfide saturated water out of the ship, in order to make the eventual draining much safer, as, relatively speaking, fresh water would come in through the various bits that hadn't been sealed yet. By the start of May, the last patch sections were in place and the pumps were switched to pumping out the water properly, and concrete seam sealant was poured in to ensure the patches were as close to watertight as possible. Now, for a third time, the grim task of cleaning the interior of the ship, and inevitably recovering bodies, could begin as the water levels dropped. By mid-May, the second deck was clear, and the usual mixture of rotten material and salvaged personal items began to make their way off the ship. Of course, after 2 additional months in the water, the 49 bodies found initially as the crew probed deeper were in an even worse state than those on California, and once again pumping was paused to allow the remains to be recovered, which left 21 men unaccounted for. As the job was completed and the pumps racked up again to full power, West Virginia rose slowly from the depths on the 17th of May 1942, rolling and pitching somewhat unevenly as water rolled around in the now free-floating ship, and more compartments were emptied, which changed the overall balance of the ship on an hour-by-hour basis. By the 24th, she was mostly level and anchored in place to stop her drifting. Additional bits of torpedo and at least one of the heavy bombs converted from a 16-inch shell, its fuse having failed, were dug out of the ship as efforts got deeper and deeper into it. But, even afloat, her draft was currently still too deep for Dry Dock 1, and by this point Dry Dock 2 was occupied by California. This was further complicated by the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington was lost and Yorktown was limping back, but would need first priority on any dry dock space, as Nimitz wanted her turned around in time to go back out with Enterprise and Hornet for what was going to prove to be the Battle of Midway. Whilst Midway was being fought, further ammunition was unloaded to try and lighten the ship to hit a 32-foot draft, which would allow it to enter Dry Dock 1. Additional bodies were being found as the deeper parts of the ship were being cleared. Eventually, a total of 67 would be recovered, which left only 3 unaccounted for once all had been said and done. But this included some real tragedies. Men were found high in the engine rooms, and in one case in a locked storeroom, where air bubbles and working bulkhead doors had kept a number of them alive. According to the calendars they'd kept, they'd been sitting in the dark for well over 2 weeks, which was well after the divers had made their first passes on the hull, hammering on the outside looking for signs of life. But the crew inside had not been heard, and gradually their air had run out. By the start of June, however, with the removal of oil from the fuel tanks, as well as 70 tons of rotten meat, milk and cheese from the refrigerated stores area, as well as secondary ammunition, the reduction in ship's draft had continued still further, and on the 7th of June, the dry dock was made ready, whilst Dry Dock 2 released California to the repair basin. With battles with the Japanese Navy becoming more frequent, the US Navy wanted the deeper Dry Dock 2 free for any critically damaged returning ships, especially carriers, and so, just after lunchtime on the 9th, tugs guided the West Virginia over the threshold to settle on the blocks ready for an extensive hull repair, which she would need if she was ever going to sail again, in Dry Dock 1. Now, every battleship that could be realistically salvaged was in the yard's hands. There was still other work to do. Oglala, Utah, Oklahoma, and the various destroyers had all had work done in the interim. For the final part of this series, we're going to consider the 2 battleships which would have further extensive salvage work done to them, plus a brief insight on the fascinating recovery of the destroyer Shaw, which we'll start with, and which will be going into in detail for reasons that hopefully will become fairly obvious. In the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attacks, USS Shaw presented a rather sorry sight. It had been hit by 3 bombs, set on fire, and then had her forward magazines explode. She was barely 2/3 of the ship she'd had once been, although in the manner of strong-willed destroyers across the world, she would stubbornly refuse to acknowledge this fact and instead remain defiantly afloat, at least for a while, albeit somewhat lower in the water and with most of the superstructure turned into confetti. What was left of the bow barely held on, using a few bits of the lower hull. As she was partly blocking the recovery of the floating dry dock YFD-2, which of course was sorely needed, work on the Shaw had started in earnest almost immediately once the fires were out. It was found that, in the interim, as the dry dock had settled into the water, what was left of the bow had eventually torn free, which actually helped the overall situation somewhat, as there wasn't a 150-ton deadweight attached to the front of the ship. Within the rest of the ship, bulkheads were rapidly shored up, holes were patched, pontoon floats were tied on, and water was pumped out. Before Christmas 1941, she'd been towed clear and placed in the repair area of the base. Her remaining 5-inch guns had been removed for reuse elsewhere, and repair work in earnest had begun. Whilst publicly listed as lost, cunning minds were already at work trying to figure out how to get what was left of the ship back to the continental United States for full restoration, and by the end of the year, Shaw was scheduled for a stay in Dry Dock 2, along with a submarine, in order to have a full bow fitted. The ragged edges of the hull were thus cut away, and what was left of her bridge superstructure was likewise removed. Then she was cycled back out into the water to make room for other ships. The false bow was lowered into place while she was still in the water, and then spot welded to the ship. A large tripod mast was dropped in replacement of the superstructure, plus a single 5-inch gun rescued from the USS Cassin was placed in her amidships position. Work could now commence on finishing the weld of the temporary bow and making the part ship watertight again. For this, she awaited the return to service of YFD-2, the floating dry dock that her detonation had helped to sink not even a couple of months earlier. Shaw entered the dock toward the end of January 1942, and in the second week of February, the men hard at work on the battleships across the Channel were treated to the bizarre sight of a pint-sized half-destroyer with an oversized mast being guided from an old-school crow's nest atop said mast and armed with a single amidships deck gun come motoring around the harbour. Having failed to either sink or arouse the wrath of an offended sea god who had possessed a sense of aesthetics, Shaw would berth alongside the USS Ward overnight, casting off after lunch the next day and heading off out to sea, destination Mare Island, the first ship of the salvage unit's long list to leave Pearl Harbor. She'd be back at the end of August, fully fighting fit, and despite sustaining damage repeatedly throughout the war, she would see the conflict through to the end. So, with a brief telling of the first ship the salvage unit managed to get back into service, what about the last two that they worked on? Well, Oklahoma, as we covered in Part 1, ended up almost upside down. The only thing preventing her from going fully over was that the superstructure had hit firmer layers beneath the mud that made up the harbour bottom, which illustrated just how shallow the anchorage actually was. No one knew exactly how badly she'd been hit, other than several reports that told of torpedoes not only blowing holes in her side below the waterline, but further weapons ripping apart the upper hull above the protective system as the ship heeled over. There was also the matter of a lot of heavy components on the ship that had never been intended to be upside down and had no doubt broken free and caused all sorts of internal damage. Whilst she was a standard battleship and thus potentially useful, if recoverable, it was obvious that she'd need a lot more time to salvage, and so priority in the early days was given largely to the ships for which a path back into service was far more obvious, and indeed far quicker. Several months would go by without any work occurring on the ship. Wallen justified this as follows. My reason for not indicating the Oklahoma in the near-term program is that writing her is likely to prove a very extensive job, and I question whether the salvaging of the vessel warrants the diversion of engineering talents, working forces, and material which would be required to do the job. After she is righted, there would be a big job of further salvage work and reconditioning to get her into service. I do not question that this can be done, but would require a year or more of time in addition to the talent of working forces mentioned. However, Oklahoma had sunk in a position that not only blocked out or disrupted a number of very valuable berths, but she had rolled partially into the main channel, which was proving to be most irritating for shipping coming in and out of the base, as they were forced to give the wreck a fair margin to avoid damage to both parties. It would have to be moved at some point. For this, the Pacific Bridge Company, whose men had been providing significant support to the US Navy during the various salvage efforts, was brought into the effort in a major way. In late February, divers had found the time to start examining the hull for damage and found at least 4 torpedo impact sites and a number of either bomb hits or near misses, caveating their report that there was a lot of mud that had been pushed up so that portions of the ship were completely obscured. Based on this, Rear Admiral Furlong drew up a plan to right the ship, but it was quite clear that no combination of floating cranes, patches or pumps would move the ship in its current state. This was a job that called for either a significant makeover of the ship to lighten it, or for sheer brute force. He wrote a letter in which he described his proposed method, based on the way that some of the German vessels of the High Seas Fleet had been salvaged from Scapa Flow, stating that it consists essentially of removing masts, turrets, and other topside weights by mechanical means or by blasting, and then to float the vessel upside down by blowing out water with compressed air. It may be found that the depth of water is not adequate for this method, but if it is, then this is probably the cheapest and quickest method of getting Oklahoma cleared. Following flotation, the vessel could be towed out to sea and sunk, or, as in the case of the German vessels, she could be placed in a dry dock if one were available for scrapping. If upon docking it's found that the vessel is in good enough condition to recondition, arrangements could be made to right the vessel. This would also permit the removal of valuable material in case reconditioning is not worthwhile. Needless to say, the amount of explosive needed to blow the gun turrets clean off a Nevada-class battleship would probably render the ship rather unsalvageable from an operational perspective, but nevertheless, the cost of doing so may be less compared to the more direct methods. However, as a clearer idea of the state of the ship was reached, the other option became much more realistic. This was far more brutally direct. Simply attach dozens of thick steel cables, find a bunch of extremely heavy-duty winches, and just haul all 27,000 tons plus who knew how much mud and water upright. But with the divers' reports painting an increasingly bleak picture of the damage to the ship and the fact that she was the second oldest standard battleship in the fleet, second only to Nevada herself, Furlong also acknowledged the labour and material necessary to float these vessels would constitute a diversion from the war effort that should be concentrated on new and vital construction and repair. The manufacture of enormous quantities of special steel cable, blocks, steel forgings and winches required for this work, and the employment of labour and skilled engineers for a year or more to raise and rehabilitate these vessels is not warranted at this time. They are much better left as post-war employment of labour. This letter covered the Oklahoma, Utah and Arizona generally. But by late April, with work on the other battleships going impressively well, a new impetus was given to the idea of at least getting Oklahoma upright again, and by May, the winch option was further developed into a working plan. Draft contracts were drawn up, materials gathered, and with West Virginia in dry dock, more skilled labour was available. By mid-July, the salvage division was ready to make a start. The first of this new work, to access and empty the accessible fuel tanks, began on the 12th of July. Whilst the winch system looked more likely, it was still hoped that perhaps by filling up part of the ship with air, the differential buoyancy could be used to get her to right herself, and maybe even stay afloat, as this would be faster. Even if the winch option was going to be used, getting an air bubble into the ship would help induce a rotational movement to the ship, as opposed to simply bodily hauling the hull towards Ford Island, and would of course make the strain on the cables and winches somewhat less. It wasn't quite as simple as that though. Exactly how the ship would behave under these forces was a matter for intense and complex calculation, as well as further physical investigation work to provide the needed data. Divers began more intense work on and in the ship itself, as well as taking samples of the harbour bottom around the ship to see what kind of resistance the seabed might offer, both in terms of releasing its hold on the upper works and what it might do when the ship started to rotate. The results were mixed. Most of the forward part of the ship was sitting in the same near-liquid mud that had tried to swallow the California, but further along the conditions changed to a mix of clay and coral that was keeping the ship from going down any further, and more crucially, should also provide a good amount of friction, which would mean that any cables hauling on the ship from Ford Island would be more likely to pull the ship over as it dragged on the bottom, and thus hopefully get the ship upright, as opposed to simply hauling the ship across the seabed towards them. There was one major risk though. If the righting of the ship was not a smooth and even movement, and the bow dipped down, then the ship might slide off the clay and coral shelf and sink irretrievably into the softer liquid mud to its fore. With the majority of the salvage work to ships that could be returned to service in good time completed, Wallen was sent on to other duties at the end of July, having brought most of the Pacific Fleet's battleships back to the surface and safely into dock. After a few quick changes, responsibility was eventually invested in Commander Whitaker, who took things forward from this point. Divers began long, dangerous journeys into the ship to open and close various hatches, reconfiguring the ship's internal structure so that a number of the undamaged areas were effectively turned into large receiving volumes for air bubbles that would be pumped in. Whilst ashore, the bases for numerous winches began to be installed, and additional pontoon tanks were prepared to be attached to the ship to aid in creating buoyancy. The hatch and door configuration was particularly vital. No hatches or doors that accessed damaged areas of the ship could be left open, as otherwise air would simply escape through the cracks and rents in the hull, But on the other hand, any hatches, bulkheads or doorways left shut within the designated air pocket volumes would inhibit the spread of the air and could leave single compartments or multiple compartments full of water, which would reduce the efficacy of the air blowing effort. This work would all take a considerable amount of time. The winch bases wouldn't be complete until November, and in the interim a hunt began for machinery to attach to them. It had to be powerful, ideally run on direct current, which was available in large amounts on Ford Island, and it needed to deliver as much of its power in the form of high torque at low rotational speed, as adding complex gearing to step down a high-speed motor would take a lot more time and money, as well as causing energy inefficiencies, which would mean that even more winches would be needed. The solution was eventually found in the motors used by the electric streetcars or trams that had served Honolulu for several decades at this point. The motors were duly brought up and installed along with a complex block and tackle system which would reduce the strain on the cables enough to allow them to do their job without snapping and cutting apart anything and anyone in a roughly 600-foot radius. The one downside to the block and tackle system was that with a fairly significant reduction ratio, there would be an awful lot of cable that would accumulate on the spindles and spools of the system and thus have to be cleared every so often. It wouldn't be one continuous movement. Frames were also attached to the ship, both to receive the cables and to increase their effect, as the turning moment would be greater with the frame sticking up away from the hull, thus again improving the efficiency of the winches. By December, the winches were almost ready, and with a control station established with equipment that allowed the speed of every single winch to be independently controlled, the first anniversary of the attack passed, and time was rapidly approaching for Oklahoma to be brought back upright. Accessible weights, like the screws, were taken off the ship, and January 1943 saw the last of the arrays on shore and aboard the ship complete. February saw the wires beginning to run from the ship to the shore, and by the 8th of March everything was ready and correct. That morning the winches began to wind under the watchful gaze of Admiral Nimitz, who'd come over to observe the work. Slowly, ever so slowly, the ship began to move. Inevitably, under the strain, various parts began to give way, and after more than half a day of hauling, the winding was halted to allow for repairs and for silt and mud that had been pushed up by the movement of the ship's hull to be dredged. The next day, the winding began again, and then once more bolts began to fail, and so the work was paused after a few hours for further repairs and reinforcement. With all of the cables under strain, this was a particularly delicate operation, and so it wasn't until the 17th that this work was complete, and another day's hauling would see the ship almost around to being just about on its side. And then over the next couple of days, as the wire that had been hauled in was cleared off the spindles and the motors restarted, the ship came past 90 degrees, eventually stabilizing at a list of 70 degrees. Here, work would pause once more, whilst water jets were used to clear mud off of the exposed portions of the ship, and much of the framework supporting the wires which had been attached to the side of the ship had to be removed, as what had been needed to provide the large turning moment before was now almost forcing the wires underwater, since the ship had now rotated and these frames were practically at horizontal. By the 20th, the ship had passed 45 degrees, and now a more delicate process of the final righting could begin. Wires had to be relocated to areas higher on the ship, one by one as the rest of them took the strain. Pumps were brought in to clear out more of the ship, and more loose material, both parts of the ship and mud, were taken off. Small pulls would continue over the next 7 weeks, with the West Virginia sailing off for Puget Sound midway through the process, until finally, by mid-June, the ship sat with a mere 2-degree list. Now the true extent of the horrific damage to the port side could be seen, and the well-practiced men of the salvage team prepared to install massive patches. The job was now pretty similar to that which had been done for the West Virginia. The pumps were started up in December to begin clearing the ship, which of course meant yet another round of cleaning out the muck and debris deck by deck as the water level dropped. On the one hand, knowing that the ship would not be returning to service at this point, the cleaning didn't have to be quite as complete and painstaking as it had been on the California, West Virginia, Tennessee, and other ships. On the other hand, after a year and a half underwater, it meant that recovering the 400 men who'd gone down with the ship was no longer a matter of recovering distinct bodies, but rather fishing out random scattered bones from the sludge. As the pumping continued, more small leaks would be identified and patched, and eventually, on the 3rd of November 1943, the ship was afloat once more. Tentative preparations were now made to bring her into Dry Dock 4, which was now complete, despite having been only a future scheme when the ship had gone down. Although a series of tragedies ended up costing the lives of 3 men and 2 divers in a matter of weeks, more than tripling the number of salvage-related deaths in the entire operation at a stroke. After careful work to make the way clear for the fragile hull, the Oklahoma was shepherded down the channel on the 28th of December 1943 with only 2.5 feet clearance from the bottom, touching down safely for the patching work that would be needed to make her watertight and thus able to be stored out of the way until she could be sold for scrap. Heading over to the Utah, the situation back in January 1942 was even less urgent than Oklahoma. Whilst she had occupied a useful berthing spot, it wasn't quite as critical as the ones on Battleship Row, and she wasn't blocking quite as many in. And so, aside from salvaging some of the anti-aircraft ammunition aboard, there was little beyond scrap value in the hull, now that it had been sunk. As a result, none of the valuable divers that had been working on the other ships had even gone down to work out what the damage was, or even how the ship was laying on the harbour bottom. This work would eventually begin in mid-January, with the main aim to ensure that the ship was stable enough for the aforementioned salvage of 5-inch ammunition, as mentioned in the previous videos. They found that the ship was resting quite firmly on solid seabed, and access work to get to the magazines could begin. Throughout most of 1942, the Utah's main contribution to the salvage work was actually done through her ordnance group. Tasked with looking after the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns on the ship before the attack, they'd proved to be a remarkably efficient and well-drilled team when it came to salvage-related work on the secondary guns, ammunition and fire control equipment of the various other ships that were in the process of being salvaged. Shortages of manpower prevented the small salvage parties assigned to the Utah from getting much deeper into the ship to recover more ammunition, as more turns in the hull, more flooding, more warped and closed bulkheads, and more hydrogen sulfide was encountered. By the end of February 1942, salvage work on the ship itself was ceased, with just over 2,500 rounds of 5-inch ammunition for the 3 kinds of 5-inch gun then in service in the US Navy having been recovered. The last men leaving the ship on the 14th, no one would return to the Utah for about a year. By the time 1943 arrived, and the main salvage efforts were complete, the Utah would see new visitors, as with only work on Oklahoma left, some divers were now spared for an investigation of the old target ship as well. Due to her lesser displacement and somewhat better position, it was viewed that, despite the damage she'd taken, the work on Utah would likely be similar to that on Oklahoma, just somewhat easier, if somewhat less urgent. As a result, more detailed survey work was undertaken as men became available from the Oklahoma, finding that the ship was somewhat further over towards vertical than Oklahoma and somewhat more down by the stern. Since the same methods were to be used, work could begin on working out what elements of the ship could be removed or had already broken off in order to lighten the ship, and a pontoon pier was built to facilitate easier access to the hull. As the winches on the other side of Ford Island began to haul the Oklahoma slowly upright, the teams who'd built the winches, foundations and frames headed across the island to replicate the process next to the Utah. Calculations on exactly what forces needed to be applied and where were begun, and the process of locking down the interior of the ship to allow the formation of air bubbles also began. Unlike all the other battleships, however, Utah's much older design was not actually sufficiently partitioned, and airlocks had to be installed in various places to ensure that there were actually multiple separated air pocket areas. 1943 turned into 1944, and it was looking like many of the men of the salvage unit would spend the entire war at Pearl Harbor. And with the fleet so much larger and the pace of war intensifying, transfers of men out to the fleet, as well as demands for equipment to assist active service ships, slowly whittled down the workforce, even as air was pumped into the Utah, ready for the final haul. Due to these delays, it wasn't until February 1944 that, with winches and cables transferred, the ship began to be hauled over. Whilst initially she rotated much more easily than Oklahoma, taking only 3 days to go from virtually upside down to a 68-degree list, it turned out that whilst the seabed had been strong enough to support her in her initial position, with the greater weight associated with her much more upright but still negatively buoyant orientation, she was actually beginning to sink into the mud, to such a degree that the cable frames had partially sunk into the mud, and the cables had to be blown off of them, since they were likewise buried. These cables were then reattached to the upper portions of the ship, and the winches hauled away again, but the more upright Utah became, the further into the mud she sank. It was a race between rotation and settling that would come to an end with the ship at a 37-degree list and completely firmly wedged into the seabed. The winches strained, but she was not going anywhere. Still, she was at least somewhat more out of the way and a lot more stable than she had been, and so with that, work ceased, and salvage-related operations that had begun whilst Japanese bullets and bombs were still flying through the air on the 7th of December 1941 would end, with the calendar marking the 15th of March 1944. With no work having been done to de-water the ship, and thus none of the remains of the trapped crew recovered, Utah's hulk was designated a war grave, the ship was formally decommissioned, and the hull left in place, where she remains to this day. To be clear, this series has not covered the full extent of all the salvage-related work that occurred at Pearl Harbor, which itself had grown around the salvage team's work from a forward base capable of repair and refits to a full-on naval facility with half a dozen dry docks, if you included the floating ones, massive stores areas, fuel farms, machine shops, and the like, capable of supporting a fleet of unparalleled size on its way to and from the war that was progressing further to the west. The salvage unit worked on many other ships during their tenure. The saga of the USS Oglala, which must have left many of the officers in charge lacking significant portions of their hair, the work first of salvaging what was still useful on the USS Arizona, and then later the first stages of turning it into a memorial, the efforts to get the USS Plunger back into service after it rather inconsiderately fell over halfway through the main body of work, blocking up valuable dock space, the application of the story of the ship of Theseus to the Cassin and Downs, and several other efforts are all part of the full story of the salvage unit. So what overall did they accomplish? In short, a huge amount. Ships thought completely unsalvageable, like West Virginia, were brought back into service. West Virginia herself was later to wreak her revenge on the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Surigao Strait, alongside fellow Pearl Harbor survivors Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, with the USS Mississippi tagging along for the ride. Vital space had been reclaimed at Pearl Harbor, which would see an influx of new ships. This photo of one of the Iowas moored alongside the hulk of the Oklahoma illustrates just how far the US Navy had advanced over the course of the war years. They also managed to give a final resting place to most of those who were missing in action in the aftermath of the 7th of December attacks, whether that be recovered to graves or forever aboard their ships, as with the Arizona and the Utah. The work of the salvage unit also saved countless lives. Their detailed and meticulous notes on where the protection systems of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships had failed, and how this could be avoided in future designs, as well as the huge amount of work calculating exactly how to safely seal off parts of a ship to secure against flooding, all fed into the rapidly growing body of knowledge that was the US Navy's damage control training efforts, which would in turn see many ships return to Pearl Harbor. Battered? Yes. Heavily burnt and listing? Certainly. Large parts missing and having gone their own way into the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Absolutely. But still, the ships, or at least what was left of them, returned, often to be patched up, turned round, and sent right back into the fight, with many of their crews thus making it home with hilarious stories like sailing halfway across the Pacific backwards, or patching the ship up with coconut trees, instead of leaving a handful of surviving officers with the task of writing hundreds of letters to grieving relatives. Outside of a few awards here and there, however, relatively little recognition was given to these hard-working men at the time, or indeed since. But hopefully, this little series has done a small part in raising their profile somewhat, as they no doubt deeply deserve. And if you'd like to learn more about some of those other salvage efforts that I mentioned, or indeed more detail about the salvage efforts on the battleships, then I would highly recommend the 3 books that have formed the core of the source material for this video, alongside the US Navy's official reports into the matter, which are of course publicly available. So the 3 books are Descent into Darkness by Edward C. Raymer. He was one of the many Navy divers who spent an awful lot of time down in the remains of various battleships, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as bedside reading unless you particularly like nightmares about being chased through sunken battleships by floating bodies, but as a bit of afternoon reading, it's definitely very, very insightful. There's also Resurrection, Salvaging the Battle Fleet at Pearl Harbor by Daniel Madston, which goes over the salvage efforts on all of the various ships and various reasons why that certain ships were salvaged before others, and is certainly an excellent read. And then you've also got Pearl Harbor, Why, How? Fleet Salvage and Final Appraisal by the, at the time of writing, Vice Admiral Homer N. Wallin. And, well, it hardly needs any further introduction as to who he was and why he was very qualified to write that book. Descent into Darkness is also available as an audiobook if you happen to want to go down that route. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I shall conclude this little series by saying raise a glass to the men of the Pearl Harbor Salvage Unit who went out of their way to prove the saying that you just can't keep a good ship down.